Harwick's coffee mug hit the edge of Lennox's tray, hard enough to send it spinning off the table, hot liquid splashing across the stack of range reports she'd been filling out since 0500. He didn't look back, just kept walking, laughing at something. Ostrowski said, the two of them moving through the chow hall like they owned the floor, which, in every way that mattered on this base, they did. Lennox didn't move. She sat there with coffee soaking through her reports and watched them go. That was day one. She had arrived at Fort Calder on a Tuesday in late October, when the Georgia wind had just started to carry real cold in it, the kind that came off the pine stands at the edge of the range and cut through a jacket like it was tissue paper. Her orders were for a 12-week advanced marksmanship integration program. AMIP, the Army's newest attempt to fold designated marksman skills into standard infantry units. The program had been running for 3 cycles. In all 3, every slot had gone to men. Lennox was the first exception. She'd driven herself from the airport, which she'd asked for. She didn't want someone driving her on to post like she needed an escort. She signed in at 1400, found her bunk in the barracks annex, a single occupancy room at the end of a hallway that smelled like floor wax and old coffee, far from the rest of the cohort, and spent the first hour sitting on the bare mattress, reading through the program syllabus. Weeks 1 through 4, Fundamentals Review, Land Navigation, Urban Ops Assessment. Weeks 5 through 9, Long-Range Precision Work, Environmental Variables, Moving Target Qualification. Weeks 10 through 12, Integrated Field Exercise, Final Evaluation Scoring. She read it twice. Then she made her bed, unpacked her gear, and went to find the range. The range wasn't hard to locate. She just followed the sound of shots until she came to a chain-link fence with a sign that read off-force personnel only and a gate that was standing open. There were 4 shooters on the line, all of them running drills with the new MK-22 PSR system the program had recently transitioned to. She stood at the fence and watched. She'd trained on the MK-22 for 7 months before putting in for the program. She knew its trigger characteristics better than she knew her own handwriting. But standing there watching, she noticed small things. The way one shooter was compensating for a flinch he probably didn't know he had, the way another was breathing too high in his chest, the way the third was reading the wind flag at the near end of the range instead of the far end where the mirage would tell him more. She filed all of it away. She didn't say anything. "You, Lennox?" She turned. A man had come up behind her, mid-40s, staff sergeant stripes, a jaw that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts. He was carrying a clipboard and looking at her the way people look at a car they're not sure they want to buy. "Yes, Sergeant," Staff Sergeant Harwick. He didn't offer a hand. "You're a day early." "My flight was earlier than expected." He looked at the range, then back at her. "You shoot?" "Some." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Come back tomorrow. Orientation's at 0700. He walked away. She watched him go. Then she turned back to the range and watched the 4 shooters until the light started to fail and they packed up their gear. Orientation was 12 people in a classroom that smelled like whiteboard marker and old AC. Lennox found a seat near the middle, not the back, not the front. Harwick stood at the head of the room with a PowerPoint that looked like it had been made in 2009 and walked them through the program structure, the evaluation criteria, the scoring rubric. Nobody introduced themselves. She didn't know any of them by name yet, only by what she'd noticed on the range. The flincher, the chest breather, the near flag reader. She gave them names in her head. Later she'd learn their actual ones. Ostrowski, Beal, Tippin, Drummond, Foss, Collar, Wack, Navarro, Simons, Perdue, Cho. 11 men in Lennox. Harwick finished the brief and asked if there were questions. One of the men, she'd learned he was Wack from a Fort Campbell unit, big through the shoulders and accustomed to taking up space, leaned back in his chair and said, "What's the washout rate?" "Program has a 30% attrition target," Harwick said. "We want the right people finishing, not just the people who showed up." Watch nodded like that satisfied him. Then he looked at Lennox, just looked. Long enough to make it clear he was doing it deliberately. She looked back. She didn't blink. She didn't smile. She just held his gaze until he was the one who looked away. That was day 2. The first 2 weeks were what they called baseline establishment, which was a polite way of saying they were figuring out who to cut first. Runs, rucks, land nav, PT batteries, obstacle assessments. Things Lennox had done so many times. They had stopped feeling like tests and started feeling like maintenance. She didn't finish first in any of them. She placed in the top 4 on everything. She understood the math of that. Finishing first made people notice you. Top 4 meant you were clearly capable, while leaving them unsure how capable. She'd learned that somewhere in her second year in uniform, when she'd realized that the fastest way to make men underestimate you was not to hide. It was to be good in a way they didn't know what to do with. The work was physical, and it was fine. The other piece was harder to navigate. The chow hall had rhythms she mapped carefully. Harkwick's group, Wack, Ostrowski, Drummond, always took the long table near the south wall. Tip and Beale, Cho ate together, quieter, less intent on performing. The rest scattered. She usually ate with Navarro, who was from a scout unit out of Fort Wainwright, and who had the unusual habit of not filling silence with noise. They ate and talked when they had something to say and didn't when they didn't. "How are you finding the course?" Navarro asked one evening. "Fine," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You're better than you're showing." She didn't answer. He didn't push. They ate. The range work started in week 3, and that was where things changed. Harwick ran the initial qualification himself, standing behind each shooter in turn and watching them work through a 50-round diagnostic set, varying distances, varying positions, timed and untimed strings. He said almost nothing while people shot. He had a small notebook he wrote in occasionally, but she couldn't see what he was writing. When it was Lennox's turn, he stood close behind her. She could feel it, that specific quality of attention that was different from observation, like he was waiting for her to fail in some particular way he'd already predicted. She sat up on the mat, ran her bolt, settled her breathing. The first target was 300 meters, prone 5 rounds in 60 seconds. She shot it clean, 5 rounds in the 9 ring or better, the last one touching the center. She worked through the rest of the string without rushing. 500 meters, then 700. A target that walked laterally at 400. A snap drill with a 5-second exposure window. She shot everything the way she'd been shooting since she was 19 years old. And her mother had first put a rifle in her hands on a lease outside Abilene and said, "Breathe out first, then squeeze, and don't fight the gun." Her mother had been Army too, 2 tours in the early 2000s, infantry support, and then out on a medical after her knee gave during a training exercise. She'd never complained about it once in Lennox's hearing. But there were nights, doing dishes or watching the news, when she'd go quiet, in a way that said more than complaining would have. Lennox thought about her sometimes when she was on the line, not consciously, not as a strategy, just her mother was in the muscle memory somehow, in the exhale before the trigger, in the patience. She finished the diagnostic string and stood up. Harwick was looking at his notebook. He wrote something, crossed something out, looked at the target through his binoculars, didn't say anything. "How'd it score?" she asked. "I'll post scores tonight." He moved to the next shooter. She picked up her brass. She didn't ask again. The scores went up that evening on the whiteboard outside the day room. She was second overall, 2 points behind Drummond, who had shot the clean string she'd been expecting from him based on his technique. She'd noticed his breathing when she watched him work. Slow, controlled, military diaphragm, trained and internalized. He was good. She had no issue acknowledging that. Wack was 8th, Ostrowski was 6th. She saw Wack look at the board, then look at her name, then look away. That night she sat on her bunk and stripped and cleaned the MK-22 she'd been issued, working through each component by feel in the low light because she'd trained herself years ago to be able to do it without looking. Field conditions weren't always well lit. You learned to work with what you had. Her phone showed a missed call from her father. She called. "How is it?" he asked. He always opened with that. Just how is it? Like the simplest question was enough. "Good," she said. "The range work is solid. Anyone giving you trouble?" She thought of the coffee on her range reports. The look in the chow hall. The specific quality of Harwick's silence after her diagnostic string. "Nothing I can't manage," she said. There was a pause on his end. Her father had never served, but he'd raised a daughter who had, which meant he'd learned a particular kind of listening. He could hear what she was leaving out. "You're placing well?" he asked. "Second after the first qualification. Second's fine," he said. "Second means you're in the room." The pivot came in week 5. That was when the program moved from general marksmanship into the work that separated it from standard infantry qualification, the long-range precision curriculum. 700 meters and beyond, environmental analysis, atmospheric data integration, shooting in conditions that required you to account for wind, elevation, temperature, humidity index, the Coriolis effect at distances where it actually started to matter. It was here that most of the group began to struggle. Beale dropped a point per session for 3 sessions running. Then had a breakthrough day where he put 9 out of 10 inside the 8 ring at 800 meters and looked like he'd discovered something important. Purdue shot consistently, but without any evident understanding of why he was hitting. He was a natural in the way that natural often means fragile. No technique to fall back on when conditions shifted. Tippin worked carefully and methodically and placed middle of the pack in everything, which was exactly as good as middle of the pack was going to be for program purposes. Drummond was still first. Lennox was still second, but the gap between them was narrowing. The problem for most of them was the wind. Fort Calder's range ran southwest to northeast, which put the prevailing wind at a quartering angle to the line of fire. Variable, inconsistent, the kind of condition that punished guessing and rewarded reading. You had to watch the mirage, the flags, the grass at the berms, the way the distant tree line moved. You had to hold all of it in your head simultaneously and then let go of all of it at the moment of the shot. And trust what you'd calculated. Lennox had been doing it since she was 19. She didn't think about it anymore as a process. It had become something more like instinct, except that it wasn't instinct. It was 10,000 repetitions, so thoroughly internalized that it felt like instinct. There was a difference, and she knew the difference mattered, because instinct you couldn't teach yourself out of when you were wrong, but technique you could. She shot a 96 out of 100 in the week 5 evaluation. Drummond shot a 94. For the first time, she was first. She heard them talking about it 2 days later. She wasn't trying to listen. She was in the equipment bay doing inventory on her kit, and the voices came through the partition wall from the hallway outside without any effort on her part. Walk's voice first. She got lucky on the wind call. Then Ostrowski. 2 sessions in a row is lucky. A pause. Then Walk again. Program wasn't built for this. She kept counting magazines. Her hands didn't stop moving. She knew from experience that the specific anger she was feeling right now was not useful information. It told her nothing she didn't already know about Walk's opinion of her. But she also knew there was a version of herself not far away that would have gone through that partition and said something she'd regret. She'd learned to feel that version of herself and walk in the other direction. She finished inventory, logged it, and left through the other door. The evaluation that broke the cohort happened in week 7. Harwick ran a scenario exercise, 4 shooters at a time, working from hides they'd constructed themselves, simulating a multi-hour observation and precision fire task. You had to build the hide, maintain it for 6 hours, and then, at a time determined by an OPFOR team that didn't tell you when they were coming, acquire and engage 4 targets in sequence under time pressure. The point wasn't just the shooting. The point was the waiting. 6 hours motionless in a position you couldn't shift out of, watching, reading, staying switched on, without switching into the kind of tension that made you move, which gave you away, which caused you to fail. Most people couldn't do it, not because they lacked physical capability, but because they couldn't manage the inside of their own heads for 6 hours with nothing to do but exist. Lennox could. She had learned it doing Overwatch on a deployment that she didn't talk about, at length 14 months, that had taken her to places where the waiting was sometimes longer than the mission, and the mission was sometimes just the waiting. She built her hide in a shallow depression between 2 scrub oaks at the edge of the designated zone, used pine duff and low brush to break her outline, lay down in the cold Georgia dirt at 0600 and stayed there. 6 hours. She watched a hawk work the thermals above the range for most of the morning. She tracked a rainstorm coming in from the northwest. She noted the shift in wind direction at 10:30, a 40-degree change that would require elevation adjustment at the distances she expected the targets to appear. The OPFOR came at 12:47, 4 targets, staggered appearances, 30-second exposure windows. She hit all 4 in sequence, the last one with 4 seconds to spare. She lay still for another 10 minutes after the range went cold, letting the adrenaline work out of her system before she moved. Then she got up, removed her hide, walked back to the staging area. Drummond was already there. He'd hit 3 of 4. "Nice shooting," he said. "No edge in it. Just a statement." "You too," she said. She meant it. Walk washed out that afternoon. He'd missed the window on targets 2 and 4, and he'd been clocked moving in his hide at the 4-hour mark. A small movement, weight shift, but enough. Harwick marked it without comment on the evaluation sheet, and when Walk confronted him afterward in the hallway, voice raised, Harwick just looked at him until he ran out of words. She didn't witness it directly. She heard about it from Navarro, who had seen it while coming back from the showers. He said the course was rigged, Navarro told her. Against whom? He didn't specify. Navarro looked at her. We both know what he meant. She did. She also knew that whatever Wok meant was no longer her problem, because Wok had failed the 7-week evaluation and would be returning to his unit by end of week. She felt something about that. She wasn't sure it was satisfaction exactly. It was closer to resolution, a chapter ending. 8 weeks in, 5 people remained in the cohort. Lennox, Drummond, Navarro, Beale, and Cho. The field schedule intensified. 12-hour range days, night shoots, moving target complexes, scenarios that combined marksmanship with decision-making under incomplete information. The kind of work where technical skill was necessary but not sufficient, where you could put the round exactly where you'd calculated and still fail because you'd read the situation wrong. It was also here that something shifted with Harwick. It was subtle. She almost missed it. One morning he came to the line while she was settling into position for a cold bore shot, and he stood behind her, the way he always had. But there was something different in the quality of his presence. Less waiting for failure. More just watching. She made her adjustments, ran her dope, broke the shot. The round hit. Wind was softer than the flag was showing, he said. Yes, she said. How'd you know? She thought about how to answer that. The grass at the far berm wasn't moving the same as the flag. Flags mounted on a rigid pole, it lags. Grass reads faster. A long pause. Yeah, Harwick said. It does. He walked to the next shooter. She watched him go. She didn't read anything into it. You didn't read things into small moments from men who'd spent 8 weeks looking for reasons to doubt you. You noted it, filed it, and kept working. The final evaluation was 3 days. Day 1, written technical assessment. Atmospheric data, ballistic charts, equipment maintenance, decision-making scenarios described in text form with required written justification. Day 2, range qualification. 100-round comprehensive set, all positions, all distances out to 1,100 meters, with a wind condition that shifted 4 times during the shoot. Day 3, integrated field exercise. A scenario that lasted 18 hours, combining observation, targeting, movement, and fire tasks, with an OPFOR element that was actually motivated. She slept poorly the night before day 1. Not from anxiety, she knew the material, but from something harder to name. A particular alertness that her body had learned to produce before things that mattered. She lay on her bunk and looked at the ceiling and thought about her mother, who had never gotten this far. Not because she couldn't have, because the Army hadn't given her a path that went this direction. Because there hadn't been an AMIP when her mother was serving, and even if there had been, the question of whether they'd have let her in was a question her mother had never gotten to ask. She thought about that until the ceiling lightened, and then she got up, dressed, drank her coffee, and went. The written assessment took 4 hours. She finished in 3 and spent the remaining hour reviewing her work, changing 2 answers after reconsideration, leaving the rest. The range qualification was the best shooting she'd done in the program. The wind shifts were real. Harwick hadn't manufactured them, or if he had, he'd arranged it well. And she read each one before it arrived, adjusting her dope during the transitions rather than after. You could always tell the shooters who were reactive versus the ones who were anticipating. The reactive shooters chased conditions. She'd been taught not to chase. She shot a 98. The program record was 97, held by a Special Forces sergeant who'd come through the first cycle. Drummond looked at the score when it was posted and exhaled through his nose. 2 points, he said. 2 points, she agreed. I'll take it, he said. Means the final day is actually interesting. She almost smiled. The field exercise started at 0300 and the first hour was movement, a 4-mile route through pine and hardwood in complete darkness, no NVGs allowed for the first segment, navigating by terrain association and compass. She'd done night land nav, enough times that the dark had stopped feeling like a disadvantage. You learned to use your peripheral vision, which was better in low light than direct gaze, and you learned to move slowly enough that your feet were reading the ground before your weight committed. She reached the first cache point 17 minutes before the next closest member of the cohort. She built a position in the low ground along a creek bed, which gave her a natural screen of brush and a surface that deadened sound. She ranged the target zone and ran calculations on the morning air, which would be humid and heavy until the sun got up and the thermal inversion broke. The scenario involved an OPFOR unit that was moving through the target zone at a time she didn't know, conducting what the exercise script called sensitive material transfer. Her task was observation, documentation, and if required, Precision fire on specified targets. Equipment, not personnel. The exercise used thermal reflective panels on steel targets mounted on the OPFOR's vehicle. She watched for 11 hours. The OPFOR came at 14:04, which she knew because she'd been tracking their tell, a specific radio frequency she'd isolated on the monitoring equipment she'd been issued, which had been cycling on a 45-minute pattern since 0800. At 13:59, the pattern broke, which told her they were moving to transmit silence, which told her they were close. She was already set. The vehicle came into view at the far edge of her firing solution. She confirmed the target panels, ran a final wind check, 6 to 8 knots, quartering, stable now, and engaged the designated targets in sequence. First panel, second panel, third. Then the vehicle changed direction, moving out of her solution, and the fourth panel was now at a crossing angle she hadn't calculated for. 45 seconds. She rebuilt the solution in her head. Wind hadn't changed. Angle was oblique now. She needed to account for the lateral component of the target's movement, which meant she was leading a moving target at 620 meters on a non-standard angle, with a wind condition she had calculated but not verified for this position. She breathed out. She broke the shot. The fourth panel registered. She lay still in the creek bed for a long time after the exercise ended. The light was going golden through the pine crowns. Somewhere a long way off, she could hear the bass starting to wind down into evening. She thought about nothing in particular. She thought about the creek smell and the cold that had settled into her hip where the ground was wet and the way the light moved in the tree crowns, and for a while that was enough. The scoring took 2 days. When the final standings were posted, Lennox was first, Drummond was second, Navarro third, Beale and Chow completed the program. Harwick called her in separately that afternoon. She sat across the desk from him in his office, which smelled like old paper and gun oil and coffee from a maker that had probably been there since the Clinton administration. He put a folder on the desk and slid it across to her. Inside were the scores from all 3 days, her written assessment with his annotations, and a program completion certificate with her name typed at the top. He didn't say anything for a moment. She waited. "You shot a 98 on day 2, he said. "Yes, program record, I know." He looked at her for a long time. She'd gotten used to his silences. She knew now that they weren't hostile, exactly. They were just how he processed things he didn't have a prepared answer for. "Day 1, he said, week 1. I made assumptions." She waited. "They were wrong," he said. He said it the way men say things they've needed to say for a while and haven't liked needing to say. "Doesn't change the record." "No," she said. "It doesn't." He picked up the folder and handed it back to her across the desk. "Congratulations, Sergeant Lennox," he said. "Program's complete." She took the folder. She stood up. She didn't tell him she'd forgiven him because she hadn't decided yet whether she had. She didn't tell him it was fine because some parts of it hadn't been. She just said, "Thank you, Staff Sergeant," and meant the professional version of it, which was enough for both of them. She called her father that night from the parking lot of the barracks, sitting on the hood of her car, because the metal was warm from the afternoon sun and she wanted to be outside. "How'd it go?" he asked. "First," she said. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful in the way it got when he was feeling something he didn't have a word for. "Your mother would have." He started and then stopped. "I know," she said. They stayed on the line for a while without talking. The Georgia evening was coming down dark and cool. Across the parking lot, she could see the lights on in the day room, where the rest of the cohort was probably still filling out their out-processing paperwork. She could see Navarro's silhouette through the window, head down over a desk. She'd come here to prove something. She wasn't sure anymore that proving it to anyone else had ever really been the point. The record was on paper. The scores were real. The 4 targets in the field exercise were marked, in the official program documentation, as hits. Those were facts now. They'd always be facts. She sat on the hood of her car and listened to her father, breathed, and watched the stars come out over the pine line, one at a time, steady and indifferent, and very far away. And she was still sitting there, long after the day room lights went out.